The crystalline spires of Lemuria's capital city pierced the lavender sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces refracting the light of twin suns into countless rainbow cascades. Riker Shaw stood at the viewport of the diplomatic shuttle, his dark eyes reflecting the alien landscape below. After 15 years in the Interstellar Diplomatic Corps, he thought he'd seen everything. Lemuria proved him wrong. Approaching Royal Landing Platform Alpha, announced the pilot. Ambassador Shaw, please prepare for atmospheric adjustment. Riker adjusted his atmospheric regulator, a small device attached to his collar that would help him breathe in Lemuria's unique atmosphere. The mission brief had been clear: establish formal diplomatic relations with the Lemurians, a species that had achieved interstellar travel centuries before humans had mastered flight. The landing platform resembled a massive lotus flower carved from living crystal, its petals adjusting their angle to accommodate the shuttle's descent. As Riker descended the ramp, he noticed how the crystal seemed to sing with each step, creating subtle harmonics that rippled through the structure. A delegation of Lemurians awaited him. Their tall, elegant forms were adorned with crystalline growths that seemed to pulse with internal light. Their skin held an opalescent quality, shifting colors like the surface of a soap bubble. But it was their eyes that captured Riker's attention, multifaceted like diamonds, yet warm with intelligence. "Welcome to Lemuria, Ambassador Shaw," spoke the lead delegate, her voice carrying musical undertones that seemed to resonate with the crystal around them. "I am First Minister Neria. The royal court awaits." As they walked through corridors that seemed to have been grown rather than built, Riker felt a subtle pressure at the edge of his consciousness. It wasn't uncomfortable, more like the feeling of someone watching from just outside his peripheral vision. He'd been briefed about the Lemurians' limited telepathic abilities, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The Great Hall of Crystalline Voices lived up to its name. Thousands of crystal formations created natural acoustics that carried whispers from one end to the other with perfect clarity. The assembled court members stood in tiered formations, their crystalline adornments creating a living light show as they moved. It was then that Riker first saw her. Princess Vila stood beside the empty throne, her presence commanding attention without effort. Unlike the other Lemurians, her crystal formations formed intricate patterns that resembled ancient script. Her eyes met his, and the pressure in his mind suddenly focused into crystal clarity. "You hear me, don't you?" The thought wasn't his own. Riker maintained his diplomatic composure, but his heart raced. Direct telepathic communication with humans was supposed to be impossible. Yet here he was, receiving the princess's thoughts as clearly as spoken words. "Yes," he projected back, surprising himself with how natural it felt. The princess's eyes widened slightly, the only break in her royal composure. The First Minister was speaking, introducing Riker to the court, but the words seemed distant compared to the silent exchange taking place. "This changes everything," came Vila's thought. "The prophecy speaks truth." Before Riker could question what she meant, the ceremony began. The empty throne loomed large, King Thorax's absence conspicuous. The official explanation, meditation in preparation for the diplomatic summit, felt hollow now. As Riker presented his credentials and spoke of Earth's desire for peaceful relations, he became aware of undercurrents in the court. Whispered conversations, subtle shifts in positioning, and most notably, the way certain court members watched the princess with barely concealed concern. The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of truths, where both parties would share a genuine fact about their worlds. As Riker stepped forward to participate, the pressure in his mind increased. Vila's presence was stronger now, and with it came fragments of emotions, worry, hope, and something deeper he couldn't quite identify. "Earth stands ready to share knowledge and friendship," Riker declared, his voice carrying through the perfect acoustics. But in his mind, he added, "There's more happening here than a simple diplomatic mission, isn't there?" Vila's response came as she performed the traditional gestures of the ceremony. "The silence of the king holds many secrets, Ambassador." Some truths can only be shared between minds that bridge worlds. As the assembled court dispersed, Riker caught glimpses of hurried conversations and concerned glances. The First Minister approached him, her expression carefully neutral. "Ambassador Shaw, you've demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to our ways. The Princess requests your presence at tomorrow's dawn ceremony. It is unprecedented for an off-worlder to attend." Riker accepted with appropriate diplomatic grace, but his mind was already reaching out, seeking that fascinating connection he'd discovered. He found Vila's presence waiting, like a lighthouse in fog. "Tomorrow," her thought came. "Tomorrow we begin to understand why you can hear me, and what it means for both our worlds." As Riker was escorted to his quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that his mission had just become far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The empty throne, the princess's cryptic messages, and most importantly, their impossible mental connection, all pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed when he'd landed. In his quarters, the crystal walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his thoughts. Somewhere in the vast palace, a princess with diamond eyes was guarding secrets that could reshape the relationship between their species. And somehow, Riker Shaw, a career diplomat from Earth, had become entangled in a mystery that went far beyond traditional diplomacy. The twin sun set, painting the crystal city in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow would bring the dawn ceremony, and with it, Riker suspected, the first steps down a path that would change everything. He only hoped he was prepared for where that path might lead. The dawn ceremony began as the first of Lemuria's twin suns peeked over the horizon. Riker stood among the court officials in the resonance chamber, where towering crystal formations caught the early light and transformed it into mesmerizing patterns across the gathered assembly. The absence of King Thorax felt even more pronounced in this intimate setting. Princess Vila entered wearing ceremonial robes that seemed to capture and amplify the dawn light. Her crystal formations glowed with an inner fire, and Riker noticed that several court members took involuntary steps backward. The connection between their minds strengthened immediately. "They fear what they don't understand," Vila's thoughts reached him. "Watch carefully, Ambassador. Not everything is as it appears." The ceremony itself was unlike anything in Earth's diplomatic protocols. The gathered Lemurians began to sing, their voices creating complex harmonics that made the crystal chambers vibrate in sympathy. The sound built to a crescendo, and the crystals throughout the room began to glow with increasing intensity. First Minister Neria approached the central crystal formation, her voice rising above the others. "We gather to honor the wisdom of the ancestors," she proclaimed. "To seek their guidance in these times of change." As if in response, the central crystal array pulsed with light, and suddenly the chamber was filled with holographic images, scenes from Lemuria's ancient past. Riker watched in fascination as the history of their civilization played out before him. But something caught his attention, recurring images of beings that looked remarkably similar to humans. "You see it too," Vila's thought came to him. The prophecy of the star-crossed wasn't metaphorical after all. Before Riker could respond, a commotion erupted from the back of the chamber. A group of Lemurians, their crystal formations glowing an angry red, pushed their way forward. Their leader, a stern-faced elder with intricate crystal patterns covering most of his form, pointed accusingly at Vila. "The princess corrupts our sacred ceremonies by allowing this off-worlder to attend." His voice carried the weight of authority. "High Counselor Drax demands this cease immediately." Vila stood her ground, her mental presence in Riker's mind remaining calm despite the confrontation. "High Counselor Drax speaks of corruption while hiding behind his proxies. If he has concerns, let him voice them himself." The chamber erupted in whispers. Riker caught fragments of conversation about Drax's mysterious absence from court functions, coinciding with the king's withdrawal. The parallel didn't escape him. First Minister Neria attempted to restore order, but the damage was done. The ceremony dissolved into heated discussions and pointed looks. Through it all, Riker maintained his diplomatic composure, even as his mind raced with questions. Later, in the relative privacy of the Crystal Gardens, Vila explained more. The gardens were a maze of living crystal formations that responded to emotional states, creating an ever-changing landscape of color and light. High Counselor Drax leads the purist faction, she said aloud, while her thoughts provided deeper context. He was the last person to speak with my father before the king's withdrawal. And no one has directly communicated with either of them since? Riker asked, noting how the crystals around them shifted to deeper blues and purples. My father sends proclamations through his servants, but refuses all direct audience. Vila's crystal formations dimmed slightly. Even me. There's more, her thoughts continued. The prophecy I mentioned, it speaks of a union between the stars that would either strengthen or destroy Lamaria, depending on how one interprets the ancient texts. A sound made them both turn. Minister Neria stood at the garden's entrance, her expression troubled. Princess, the High Council requests your presence. Alone. Vila straightened, every inch the royal she was. Very well. To Riker, her thoughts added, meet me at the Archive of Whispers at midnight. There's something you need to see. As Riker watched her leave, he became aware of other presences in the garden. Guards, he realized, but not the regular palace security. These moved differently, their crystal formations muted as if to avoid attention. Back in his quarters, Riker composed his official diplomatic reports, carefully omitting any mention of his telepathic connection with the princess. His years of experience told him that revealing such information prematurely could destabilize an already volatile situation. As night fell, the crystal city transformed. Bioluminescent life forms drifted through the air like floating jewels, their light creating ever-changing patterns against the crystal structures. Riker made his way to the Archive of Whispers, using the diplomatic access codes Vila had mentally shared with him. The archive was ancient, predating even the Crystal Palace itself. Here, the earliest records of Lemurian civilization were stored in crystal matrices that could only be accessed by those who knew their secrets. Vila waited for him near a section that seemed older than the rest, its crystals clouded with age. What I'm about to show you, her thoughts came clearly, could change everything. But first, you need to understand why my father's silence is more than just a political crisis. She placed her hand on one of the ancient crystals, and it began to glow. Images formed in the air between them, star maps, ancient texts, and most surprisingly, detailed anatomical comparisons between humans and Lemurians. These records, she whispered aloud, are from the first contact era, thousands of years ago. Before we lost contact with Earth, before the great sleep that reset our civilization. Our peoples have met before, Riker. And the last time we did, both our worlds were nearly destroyed. The crystal walls around them pulsed with an urgent rhythm, and Vila suddenly stiffened. We're not alone, her thought came with a warning tone. In the shadows of the archive, crystal formations began to glow red, and footsteps echoed off the ancient walls. The truth about Earth and Lemuria's shared past would have to wait, someone had followed them, and they were about to discover just how many opposed the very idea of their worlds reconnecting. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the Archive of Whispers as Riker and Vila quickly shut down the ancient crystal display. But instead of the expected guards, a hunched figure emerged from the shadows. The elderly Lemurian's crystal formations were almost entirely dark, save for a faint pulse that matched their heartbeat. Master Valerian, Vila breathed, relief evident in her voice. You startled us. The old keeper of the archives shuffled forward, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the dim light. When crystals as old as these wake, I wake with them. His gaze fixed on Riker. So, it's true. The resonance patterns don't lie, you share the connection. We can trust him, Vila's thoughts reached Riker. He was my father's mentor before. Before the sickness began, Valerian finished aloud, making both of them start. Oh yes, I can sense your communication. Just as I sensed the king's mind becoming clouded. The revelation hung in the air like crystal dust. Riker stepped forward. Sickness? The official statements never mentioned. Official statements, Valerian scoffed, touching a nearby crystal. It illuminated, showing a recording of King Thorax from months ago. The king's crystal formations were dulled, their natural luster replaced by an unsettling opacity. Look closely, Ambassador. The signs were there for those who knew where to look. Vila's mental presence radiated distress. Father's crystals, they're dying. The Lemurian royal line has always shared a deeper connection with the crystal consciousness, Valerian explained. It's what gives the monarchy its legitimate claim to rule. But something is interfering with that connection, something that began shortly after we detected your ship entering our system. The implications made Riker's diplomatic instincts surge. Are you suggesting Earth's presence? No, Vila interrupted. It's not that simple. Show him, Master Valerian. The elderly archivist activated another crystal, this one showing a star chart. These readings were taken the day the king fell ill. Notice anything unusual? Riker studied the display, his years of space travel experience kicking in. There, at the edge of the Lemurian system, a gravitational anomaly that shouldn't exist. That pattern, it's artificial. Precisely, Valerian confirmed. Someone or something entered our system alongside your diplomatic mission. Something that's been interfering with the crystal resonance patterns that sustain our civilization. A distant alarm suddenly pierced the archive's silence. Vila's thoughts crashed into Riker's mind with urgent clarity. The High Council chamber, something's happening. They rushed through the crystal corridors, Valerian following as quickly as his aged form allowed. The alarm's pitch changed, becoming more urgent. Palace guards ran past them, their crystal formations pulsing with alert patterns. They reached the High Council chamber to find it in chaos. First Minister Neria stood at the center, her usually composed demeanor shaken. The king, she announced as they entered. He's gone. Gone? Vila stepped forward. What do you mean, gone? His private chambers are empty, Neria explained. And this was found in his place. She held up a crystal shard that pulsed with sickly light. Valerian pushed forward with surprising strength, taking the shard. His face paled. This is impossible. This resonance pattern, it's not Lemurian. It's ancient, Vila's thought completed in Riker's mind. Like the recordings we found of the First Contact era. The chamber doors burst open again as High Counselor Drax finally made his first public appearance in months. His crystal formations were changed, showing patterns Riker had never seen before. The king's disappearance proves what I've been warning about, he declared. The human presence has destabilized our very way of life. But Riker noticed something odd about Drax's movements, about the way his crystals pulsed. They weren't synchronized with his words, almost as if he's being controlled. Vila's thoughts reached him with shocking clarity. Look at his resonance pattern, it matches the shard from Father's chamber. Before anyone could react, Drax's crystals began to glow with intense energy. The Ancient Ones have awakened, he announced in a voice that wasn't quite his own. They remember the devastation of the First Contact, and they will not allow it to happen again. Energy crackled through the chamber as Drax's crystal formations began to overload. Guards moved to protect the assembled council members, but Vila stepped forward instead, her own crystals resonating in response. Riker, her thoughts came with desperate intensity, remember what we saw in the archives. The connection between our peoples, it's not just diplomatic. It's part of something larger, something older than both our civilizations. As if in response to her words, the shard in Valorian's hands began to pulse in sync with Riker's heartbeat. The old archivist's eyes widened. The prophecy speaks of a bridge between worlds, he whispered. Not just between planets, but between times. Drax raised his hands, crystal energy building to dangerous levels. The cycle ends here. But his voice kept shifting between his own and something ancient, something that carried echoes of a conflict long forgotten. In that moment, surrounded by the growing chaos, Riker made a decision that would change everything. He reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind, embracing the connection he shared with Vila and pushing it further than ever before. The crystal shard responded, its light changing from sickly purple to pure white. Together, Vila's thoughts merged with his own, their shared consciousness reaching out to touch the ancient presence that had taken hold of Drax. In that connection, they glimpsed the truth, a truth that would either save both their worlds or tear them apart forever. The chamber erupted in brilliant light as past and present collided, and the true purpose of Riker's diplomatic mission finally began to unfold. The blinding light faded, leaving the High Council chamber in an eerie silence. High Counselor Drax lay unconscious, his crystal formations now dormant. But the ancient presence hadn't been defeated, merely displaced. Through their shared mental connection, Riker and Vila could feel it retreating deeper into Lemuria's crystal network. The archives, Valerian gasped, clutching the now pulsing crystal shard. It's heading for the deepest levels, where the first ones sleep. Vila's mind touched Riker's with urgent clarity. The ancient records we found, they weren't just historical documents. They're a warning. First Minister Neria took command of the situation, ordering guards to secure the chamber and tend to Drax. Princess, she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, the succession protocols are clear. With your father missing, you must. No, Vila interrupted, her crystal formations glowing with newfound purpose. The protocols were designed for a different time. What we face now is beyond anything our ancestors anticipated. She turned to Riker. Almost anything. The memories they'd glimpsed in their shared consciousness still burned bright, ancient Lemurians and humans, standing together against a threat that transcended space and time. The same threat that had forced both civilizations to forget each other, to sleep through millennia until the danger had passed. Or so they'd thought. We need to reach the deep archives, Vila's thoughts came as they hurried through crystalline corridors, Valerian guiding them to restricted access points. Before it awakens the others. The deeper they descended into the crystal city's foundations, the more ancient the architecture became. The neat, geometric patterns of modern Lemurian crystal work gave way to organic, almost liquid formations that seemed to respond to their presence. The first ones built these chambers, Valerian explained, his aged hand touching the living crystal walls. They understood things about the crystal consciousness that we've long forgotten. The king, he was researching this place in secret before his illness began. They reached a vast chamber that defied conventional architecture. Crystal spirals twisted up into darkness, each containing what appeared to be stasis pods. Inside each pod, barely visible through clouded crystal, were figures that combined human and Lemurian features. Hybrids, Riker breathed, understanding dawning. The first contact era didn't end in destruction. It ended in union. And separation, Vila's thoughts added. A deliberate choice to protect both our species from something worse. A deep resonance began to build in the chamber. The ancient presence they displaced from Drax was here, stronger than ever. The crystal walls pulsed with patterns that hurt to look at, telling a story of betrayal and sacrifice. Through their shared connection, Riker and Vila saw the truth. The first ones, human Lemurian hybrids, had discovered something in the space between dimensions. Something that fed on conscious energy, that saw the combined potential of both species as a feast too tempting to ignore. The Great Sleep wasn't just about waiting, Valerian revealed, reading from patterns in the crystal walls that only he could fully decipher. It was about evolution. Changing both our species so we could one day face the threat together. The chamber's crystals began to sing with dangerous harmonics. Stasis pods started to crack, the hybrid ancestors stirring within. The ancient presence was trying to wake them prematurely, before the evolutionary process was complete. Your father, Riker's thoughts reached Vila with sudden understanding. He found out about this. That's why. Yes, she responded. He put himself into stasis to complete the change. To become what we need to be. The king's disappearance made sense now. He hadn't abandoned his people, he'd sacrificed himself to become something more. But the ancient presence was corrupting the process, using the hybrid ancestors to create something twisted and wrong. Riker felt the diplomatic part of his mind, the part trained to analyze, negotiate, and find peaceful solutions, wrestling with the impossible situation. But there was no negotiating with this entity. It had waited millennia to consume the combined potential of humanity and Lamaria. The stasis pods continued to crack. Time was running out. The prophecy speaks of a choice, Valerian said urgently. A bridge between worlds that would either unite or destroy. But it never specified which worlds, physical space, or the space between dimensions. Vila's crystal formations began to pulse in sync with Riker's heartbeat. We are the bridge, her thoughts merged with his. Not just between Earth and Lamaria, but between past and present. The ancient presence surged, trying to break their connection. But something else was happening. The king's crystal shard in Valorian's hand began to glow with pure white light, responding to their unified consciousness. Through their mental link, they could feel others awakening, not the twisted versions the ancient presence wanted, but the true heirs of both worlds. The king's consciousness reached out to them from somewhere in the crystal matrix, showing them what needed to be done. They had one chance to complete what the first ones had started. To face the entity that had haunted both their species since before recorded history. To prove that the connection between humans and Lemurians wasn't a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that transcended physical form. As the chamber erupted in crystalline energy, Riker and Vila stood together, their minds united, ready to face an enemy that had waited millennia for this moment. The true test of their bond, and the future of both their species, was about to begin. The deep archive chamber became a maelstrom of crystalline energy as the ancient presence launched its assault. Fractured stasis pods released their hybrid ancestors, but something was wrong with them. Their forms flickered between physical and energy states, corrupted by the entity's influence. The dimensional barrier is weakening, Valerian warned, his aged hands working frantically over a crystal control matrix. It's trying to force complete manifestation. Through their shared consciousness, Riker and Vila witnessed the entity's true form, a void that hungered for the unique energy created by human-Lemurian connections. Every telepathic link, every shared thought between their species created ripples in dimensional space that it could feed on. That's why the first ones separated our peoples, Vila's thoughts merged with Riker's understanding. They couldn't defeat it, only deny its sustenance. But denial had only made it stronger, more desperate. Now it sought to use the hybrid ancestors as conduits, turning their combined potential into a bridge it could cross completely into their reality. The king's consciousness reached out to them again through the crystal network. In the stasis chamber where he had hidden himself, King Thorax was completing his transformation, not into a hybrid, but into something else entirely. A guardian, evolved to protect the space between dimensions. The prophecy, Riker's thoughts crystallized with sudden clarity. It wasn't about preventing union between our species. It was about waiting for the right kind of union. The ancient presence screamed in frequencies that shattered lesser crystals. It had waited too long, grown too hungry to be denied. The corrupted hybrids moved forward, their forms leaving trails of distorted spacetime. Vila's crystal formations began to change, responding to their shared realization. Father, she called out both mentally and verbally, show us how. The king's consciousness enveloped them, guiding their connection deeper. Riker felt his understanding of reality shift as human intuition merged with Lemurian crystal sense. They weren't just sharing thoughts anymore, they were becoming something new, something that could exist in the space between spaces. The first ones didn't fail, Valerian said, reading the truth from patterns appearing in the ancient crystal walls. They sacrificed themselves to plant seeds in both our species. Seeds that would grow into the ability to face this threat. The entity surged forward, using the corrupted hybrids as weapons. But with each attack, Riker and Vila's shared consciousness expanded. Their combined presence began to fill the dimensional space that the entity had claimed, not with hunger but with understanding. "We are the bridge," their unified thoughts resonated through the crystal network. Not between worlds, but between states of being. The king's transformation completed. His new form emerged from stasis, neither human nor Lemurian but a crystalline embodiment of conscious energy. Through him, the full knowledge of the first ones poured into Riker and Vila's shared mind. The entity had evolved to feed on connections between consciousness, but it had never understood the true nature of those connections. It saw them as energy to be consumed, not as the fundamental force of reality they truly were. Together, Riker and Vila began to glow with the same pure light as the transformed king. Their physical forms remained unchanged, but their shared consciousness expanded into the dimensional space around them. They weren't fighting the entity, they were offering it a choice. Understanding goes both ways, their unified thoughts reached into the void. You don't have to consume connections to experience them. The entity recoiled, its hunger warring with the first real contact it had experienced in millennia. The corrupted hybrids froze, caught between its influence and the pure resonance emanating from Riker and Vila. In that moment of choice, the king's consciousness joined fully with theirs. Three perspectives, human, Lemurian, and transcendent, created a harmony that the entity couldn't ignore. The dimensional space between realities filled with light as ancient barriers dissolved. The entity's hunger transformed into something else, comprehension. It had spent eons consuming the energy of connections because it had never understood how to create connections of its own. The corrupted hybrids began to stabilize, their forms settling into pure expressions of human Lemurian potential. Through the crystal network, awareness spread throughout the city above. The truth of their shared history, the real reason for their long separation, and the promise of their combined future rippled through both human and Lemurian consciousness. First Minister Neria found them later in the chamber, surrounded by awakened hybrid ancestors who had been purified by their shared revelation. The entity's presence remained, but transformed, no longer a threat, but a guardian of the connections it had once sought to devour. "The king?" she asked, seeing how the crystal formations throughout the chamber had changed. "Has become what we all might one day become," Vila answered aloud, while her thoughts remained linked with Riker's. "A bridge between what is and what could be." The diplomatic implications were staggering. Earth and Lemuria would have to navigate a relationship far more complex than simple interstellar politics. But as Riker stood beside Vila, their shared consciousness still echoing with the knowledge of ages, he knew that complexity was exactly what both their species needed. "Ready to help me explain this to the Ambassador Corps?" His thoughts reached out to her with a touch of humor. "Only if you'll help me reorganize a society that just rediscovered its true heritage," she responded in kind. Above them, the crystal city sang with new harmonies as humans and Lemurians began to rediscover their shared potential. The silence of secrets had been replaced by the music of understanding. And in the space between dimensions, a transformed entity stood guard over connections it now helped to nurture rather than consume. The bridge between worlds had been built, not through fear or force, but through the one power that transcended all realities, the choice to understand rather than divide, to connect rather than consume, to love rather than fear. And that was just the beginning.